everyone. So what's up? Glad that you're able to watch this. I hope that everyone is doing well and staying safe still. So last week we talked about basically just does God exist? And this week we're going to be discussing a potential problem for the existence of God. Because last week all the arguments that we saw were in favor of God existing, and this week we're looking at this big problem that theists must have a response to, that is the problem of evil. So, thanks everyone for turning in your critical summaries last week. They were really, really interesting, and I really enjoyed reading them. One thing that I realized I needed to mention, just to be clear, was something that I saw in a few different papers, and I realized that I wasn't clear about this. So, that's my dog at the door. I'm gonna pretend like he's not there. So, anyways, one thing that people thought that wasn't actually the case was, so Anselm was arguing for the existence of God, right? So his argument was that God must actually really exist in real life. So some people read that and thought that Anselm was arguing that God is a human being. By real, it might seem that he's talking about flesh and blood. That's not what he was arguing. By real, he just, in really existing in the world, he didn't mean a human being. He just meant actually exists, isn't made up. So I clarified that in some of the comments on the critical summaries, but I realized that could have been a problem that a lot of people thought. So I wanted to make that clear. So whenever he was saying God obviously exists in your understanding if you're able to think of God, and then he attempts to prove that God exists actually, really, in the real world. And so, yeah, that doesn't mean that he was trying to say that God was a human being. Now, one thing that Anselm did believe, he was a Trinitarian Christian, so he believed in the Trinity. So he believed that Jesus was God and fully man, fully God. But that's not what that argument was about. So that was just the basis for there being a God at all. So yeah, he wasn't arguing whether God actually walked the earth or not. It was just because God could really exist and really be a being without having a body, right? So that's something to keep in mind, that the terminology can be weird, and I forget to clarify things that I should clarify. So just wanted to touch on that. Other than that, it seemed like y'all had a really good grasp of what was happening. So for the critical summaries, just remember the best way to do it, and there are other ways, but this is the most simple way, is to just use the first half of that page and a half or so summarizing your reading. And it's easier, I think, to choose a short part of the reading, maybe just one of the philosopher's arguments. Take that, summarize it, and then in the next half explain why you disagree or agree, or your thoughts on it. That should be the perfect formula for a good paper. But everybody did well, and some people did it a different way and were able to still meet all the requirements and did great. So no worries either way. So as I stated, this week we're talking about the problem of evil, and one thing that is important to talk about before we dive in is who or what God is. So for what we are talking about, God is my whiteboard that is not that convenient. Omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. So what that means is that God is all, this is weird, I don't like that angle, all powerful, so omnipotent means all powerful. God is omniscient, meaning all knowing. And then God is omnibenevolent, meaning all good, or you might see morally perfect. So this would, you couldn't see the last part, but all good or morally perfect. If I had like a actual easel or something, that might be better, but we'll see. Anyways, so what this definition does immediately is separate what we're talking about from maybe some other conceptions of God. So whenever people are talking about the problem of evil, this is the type of God that they're talking about, because this separates this God from maybe like the Greek gods. Because if you know Greek mythology, I was like, what do you call it? If you know Greek mythology, you know that the different gods like definitely didn't know everything, definitely weren't all powerful, and definitely were not morally perfect. There was like a lot of bad things that they did all the time. So going ahead and defining our terms, like we talked about, is very important. Automatically separates and defines what we're talking about. So we are only talking about the God that is described as all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. This would be probably most people's idea of who God is these days. So if you're an atheist, you probably adamantly believe in not this God. So, and if you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or, I'm trying to think, those are, I mean, the three main religions that believe in one God. But I'm sure there's more I'm missing out on. But yeah, if you are any of those, or just a theist in general, this is what you believe in, typically. There can always be exceptions, but that is the main understanding of who God is. So, today we're going to be talking about just an argument against God, basically, based on this problem of evil, and then for the lecture on Thursday, we'll talk about a response to the problem of evil in favor of the existence of God. So, today is anti-God. So, the problem of evil is very, very, very old. It's like as old as Scripture itself. Thinking about, I'm not sure if anybody is familiar with the story of Job in the Bible, the Christian Bible or Hebrew Bible, but Job is this guy that is very well off, has a great life, rich, healthy, living large, and he loves God. And then God allows him to experience horrible, horrible suffering. Like, his whole family dies, he's covered in warts, he has no money, he's like just being beaten to a pulp, basically. And it's not because of anything that he did. It's not like he deserved it in that sense. He didn't like go out and murder somebody and now he's getting punished. He like loved God, was devoted to God, and over again these bad things kept happening. So most people read that and say, or might immediately think, like, that does not sound like a good God. Or that maybe that God is not all powerful, because wouldn't he stop that for this person that loves him? So even way back then, his friends were thinking the same thing. They were thinking that either he deserved it, or like there was something he could do to earn favor with God, because God wouldn't just allow this if you were doing right. So that's just an example of how this problem has been a problem for theists for forever. Because we have always known of evil. Humans have always experienced evil. And there's, always been some people who believe in God. So if there's evil and there's also an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God, to some that's a contradiction, because a good God would not allow suffering. That's basically the gist of the argument. So we will look at just a generic argument, and then we'll dive into Louise Antony's argument. So, which she titles it as the problem of suffering rather than the problem of evil. And, we'll talk about this in a sec, but I think the main point is to communicate just the sheer emotional level of it. Like, when you think suffering, you kind of feel what that word means. When you think evil, you might see it as like an abstract concept, but suffering we know well. Most people can identify with that. So, anyways, I think that was an interesting move that she made. So, the concise problem of evil. Well, first we should talk about how, in history, where has this come up? So, obviously, we talked about with Job. That's an example we can think about. Another is, we talked about the different eras in philosophy. And in ancient Greek philosophy, which was, 500 BC to 100 CE or whatever, at some point in that time, there was a philosopher named Epicurus. And Epicurus believed in, living life to its fullest. Epicureanism is, eating and drinking to your fill, enjoying all pleasures everywhere, having a good time. He was somewhat, this is anachronistic, but an atheist. We would consider him to be an atheist, looking back on it. So David Hume, is from the modern era of philosophy, which was he was from the 1700s. So, long time ahead, but he actually quotes Epicurus and summarizes this very problem of evil. So, he says, I'm just going to write it. He says, let's see, Hume. This is Hume quoting Epicurus. And Hume is interesting because he wasn't really allowed to say that he was an atheist or he was going to get in big, big trouble by the state. So he made quite a few arguments that, kind of show that maybe he didn't believe in God, but never came out and said, I don't believe. He would just give these arguments and kind of leave it open-ended. But to most people, it is kind of evident that he probably didn't believe in God, or at least not in the traditional way. So he's quoting Epicurus, and he says, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? So Epicurus looks out at the world, knows that there's evil, knows that there's suffering. It says, is God willing to prevent evil but just not able to? Then he is not omnipotent, meaning he is not all-powerful, which is one of the things that God in this definition must be. He must be all-powerful. Then, is he able but not willing? So is he able to prevent suffering but not willing? Then he is malevolent, which is the opposite of benevolent. So that's another doc to this God. And then, is he both willing and able? Then from whence comes evil? So this is one of the older iterations. I don't even know why I write it, but it does make me feel better to write it. So, because I do like to write if I am actually in class. But is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both willing and able? Then from whence comes evil? So, if God is both all-powerful and all-good, why would there ever be a reason for there to be evil? And, I mean, I think the most compelling way to think about this argument is to think about the most horrific thing that you can think of, which is not fun to do. I would not recommend. But if you think of something really, really horrific and tragic and traumatic, you could think of, I mean, it's so sad to even say, but like child trafficking, sex trafficking or something. And then couple that with a belief that there is a God in control of everything that is supposed to be all good. I mean, that, like, emotionally seems like a contradiction on the surface. I think even theists can admit that that seems contradictory. That doesn't mean it's a knockdown argument by any means, but it does mean that the theist needs to have a response to that. And it makes it hard to respond to that and just say, well, we just don't know. Or, well, we know that God is good, and that's just it. We don't know why bad things happen. It kind of demands some sort of response. So then we get, just in logical form, we get a simple little iteration of this exact same thing. So this is like in prose. This is the problem of evil, and then we can get the logical form of the problem of evil, which will be good. Because philosophers want to put something in logical form so we can see if it's valid, if it's a valid argument, if it's sound, or where the problem in the argument is. So if you're ever like, this doesn't sound right to me, but I don't know why, try to write it out by each step that the person is making in the argument. Right. So Louise Antony writes it out this way, just to show this is the typical logical argument from suffering. So, 1, we start with premise 1, which is that no morally good being would allow suffering if he or she were able to prevent it. So, I mean, you can just start by rejecting that claim if you wanted to, but that seems pretty intuitive, that a morally good being I gotta find a better angle. Would not allow suffering because they're good and they don't want suffering to happen. Then, an omnipotent being would be able to prevent suffering. So that's just using the definition of omnipotent, meaning all-powerful. So if someone is all-powerful, then they definitely have the power to do something specific, like prevent suffering. So then you get this sub-conclusion, this mini-conclusion right after. Therefore, if there were a morally good omnipotent being, then there would be no suffering. Then you get the next premise, which is, just from observation, there is suffering. Then you get your final conclusion, therefore, there is no being who is both morally good and omnipotent. Okay, so this is just the generic problem of, we'll call it suffering since that's what Louise Antony is calling it. Problem of suffering. Pretty much most iterations fall somewhere. Let's see if I can, yeah, there. This is in your book anyway, so. But, so that first of all should help you just see what's happening in the argument. And second of all, be sure to pay attention when I do stuff like that, just because it'll help you learn how to put an argument in logical form. So all we did was take what we wrote in prose, which is that if God is omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient, then I said all of them right, yeah. Then there shouldn't be evil in the world. I mean, that's basically all this argument is saying. And you're breaking it up into each piece. So the first piece is that a morally good being would not allow suffering. Then the second, an omnipotent being would be able to prevent it. Then, if there were a morally good omnipotent being, then there wouldn't be suffering. But there is suffering, so there's no being who is morally good and omnipotent. And we can just stop there for a sec, and someone could say, okay, I agree with that, but I still believe in a God. So if you do that, then you have to come up with a new definition of who God is, because it's not that God is omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient. So now that you've rejected that God is those things, you now believe in a different God with a different definition. So now you need to define that and give reason for changing the definition. So, yeah, you could just accept the conclusion and still think that God exists and just deny that God is morally good or omnipotent. You could say there is an all-powerful being that isn't benevolent, that isn't good. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different things you could do. But, I mean, it just depends on what you believe. But, Um, yeah, so that's just the basic bones of any problem of evil argument. Um, and Hume writes about this in the Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. That's where he makes that quote from Epicurus. And I think I have it somewhere. It doesn't matter, but yeah, maybe I don't have it. But either way, that's where he makes some arguments that are like, that sounds like it's an argument for atheism, but at the end of the book, he like tries to cover up his tracks almost, because he doesn't want to get in trouble for being an atheist. Because in the modern period, that's when like government and religion were inextricably tied. So if you didn't believe the right thing, then you could definitely get thrown into jail and get in big trouble. So anyways, that's just interesting. So now we can dive into what Louise Antony has to say about this. And just a little background on her. She's alive right now, so she's from the contemporary period. She was born in 1953 and is alive today. She's a professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. And her areas of specialization are philosophy of mind, epistemology, and feminist theory. So, and she also edited a journal called Philosophers Without Gods. So she's very pro-atheism. She even has an article that I found that she wrote for the New York Times about being a moral atheist. It's pretty interesting if you want to check it out. So an advocate for atheism, I suppose, would be an appropriate term or title. So, yeah. So this argument is an argument for atheism based on the argument from suffering. So, like I said, the first thing she does, pretty much, is to change the name from the problem of evil to the problem of suffering. And like I said, I think she makes this move because of the compelling nature of the word suffering. She says that the issue is suffering, not necessarily evil. I mean, it is, but the issue that we experience is probably more identifiable as suffering than it is evil. Yeah, because at the hand of evil comes suffering, and suffering is what humanity experiences. So murder is evil, but the suffering that comes from murder is what we experience. I think. I don't know if she would say this, but that's kind of how I'm understanding what she's doing here. And everything suffers. Like animals suffer, humans suffer. What else is there? I mean, plants die if you are really tied to plants. I guess they would experience suffering in some sort. But there's physical pain, emotional pain, like so many different types of suffering in the world. So that's one of the premises of the argument that you pretty much can't deny. You can't just say, premise 4 just isn't true because there isn't suffering. Everybody kind of has to concede to that point that, yes, there is suffering in the world, and it's really, really, really sad. So any response from a theistic perspective should be sympathetic to the fact that there is great suffering and pain in the world. And I mean, I think if you're going to have an argument supporting or defending God based on the problem of evil, that you probably have an understanding that you should be kind, hopefully, and sympathetic to the fact that there is evil in the world. So she kind of lists like all these different sufferings and says the human need for social connection makes nearly inevitable for us the searing pain of loss. How can all of this be squared with the supposition that an all-powerful being set up things with the well-being of his creatures in mind? So how could a God put everything into motion with his creatures, all of the things he's creating in mind, and there still be this amount of evil in the world? That is the number one question. You see this, another iteration of this is why do bad things happen to good people? Like, I'm sure you can think of somebody that's like the best person ever and something horrible happened to them. I know I can. There's a few. And just that alone makes humans question, I think. I think most people have had that experience of questioning if there could really be a good God in control if bad things happen so often. Yeah. So I'm excited for next time because I have things like we could talk about. Anyways, I'm trying to see if some of the things I want to say fit better today or in the next lecture. I'm thinking in the next one. Because it should be next time. Sorry. Just thinking out loud. I could edit these videos that I post, but that would take a long time, so you can just watch my wheels turn. Okay, so then we get the logical argument from suffering, which is what we just laid out, just the generic form. And then she acknowledges, she says, so this is the argument that most atheists would take and just call that good, that'll do the trick, that will combat the theists, and we're good to go. She says, while this argument is valid, meaning it necessarily follows, it's not sound. So validity and soundness are different. Sound means like whether it's true, or like, because you could have a valid argument with all the premises being false, and it's just that the logic flows right. A sound argument has to end up being true. Like your premises, all of them have to be true. So she points out this first premise, that no morally good being would allow suffering if he or she were able to prevent it. She points to that and says that premise is false. So, meaning it is the case that sometimes a morally good being would allow suffering even if he or she were able to prevent it. Then she gives an example of a loving parent. So imagine that a child loves this little toy, and the parent knows that the child left the toy outside and it's about to rain and destroy the toy. The parent doesn't tell the child. Why? Because the parent knows that the child needs to know not to leave its things outside. So it's almost like the parent is accepting that there will be suffering, the child will experience suffering, but that this valuable lesson that the child will learn through the suffering is going to outweigh the pain of the suffering. So, I feel like I've heard this from Christians, that's mostly, we're in the South, so that's mostly the arguments I would hear in favor of God would be a Christian argument. I've heard people say, like, there was more good, so God allows some evil to happen because there's more good that's going to come out of it. So something really, really bad could happen, but out of it, something really, really, really good happened. So it's like a trade-off. Momentary suffering is worth it for the long gain. That would be, or long game, whatever. That would be the argument. I'm sure we've heard some iteration of that before. You could even think about, like, disciplining. Like, a parent is... now people don't do this as much, I guess, but parents discipline their kids, maybe spank them or whatever, in order for the child to learn and to be better. So, I was definitely spanked as a child. I would do wrong stuff all the time, get into stuff I wasn't supposed to, and my mom would spank me, and that, I would have considered that suffering for sure. That was painful, not so good. Definitely, now, anyways, sorry. Like, whenever I was a kid, this is a tangent, but whenever I was a kid, and I'm not that much older than you, in my elementary school, I don't know if y'all are gonna think this is crazy, or if this was like this when y'all were in elementary school, but we had, like, our principal would spank students, and now that I think about it, I'm like, that's crazy. Like, that would never fly today. Like I remember I would walk down the hallway, and we called the piece of wood that they spanked people with, Mr. Woody. So you would know if somebody was getting beat if you were walking down the hall and you just heard someone scream. And that sounds so bad now. But then it was just like, it is what it is. Wow. Also, I was raised in a small town whenever I was in elementary school, so maybe that was part of it too. Anyways, yeah, so, what was I saying? Discipline. So that probably wasn't the best idea, but whatever. So, those students that got beat, the teacher or whoever would probably say that this momentary suffering is going to make the child not suck so bad, probably, would be the argument. Anyways, that probably wasn't the best. We shouldn't compare God to my principal that used to beat kids. It wasn't like abuse. Some people would say that probably today. You know what? Just don't worry about this. Don't worry about the past. Anyways, back to Louise Antony. I swear she would hate my principal who used to do that. She would lose her mind. Anyways, so back to the wholesome example. The child with the toy in the rain. That parent, we're not going to conclude that parent is, like, evil for allowing the child's toy to get ruined, right? Most people wouldn't. Maybe you would. But most people will acknowledge, like it's like the, some parents are, if you keep reaching for the stove and your mom says, don't do that, stop, and you keep reaching for it, at some point, the mom might say, you gotta get burned and then you're gonna learn, like, don't do that. And that's a valuable lesson. So, is that parent evil for allowing that to happen? It's up to you to decide, I guess, but most people would say probably not. Like, that's just the way people learn. So then, just through that example, we have a counterexample to the first premise. So, we have to change the first premise. It can't be that no morally good being would allow suffering if he or she were able to prevent it. It has to be something weaker than that. So, and she calls this the principle of no tolerance, because it's no morally good being would allow this. Then, we replace it with a new premise. And the new premise is that no morally good being would allow suffering if he or she were able to prevent it, unless he or she had a good reason to prevent it. So, let me use a different color. Unless she had good reason to prevent it. Wait. Had good reason to permit it, not prevent it. So, this parent has a good reason to permit the suffering. So, we're just amending this to have good reason. That's the new part. Then you have to add another premise that says there's no good reason that a morally good, omnipotent being could have to allow suffering. So then you put it together and you get the weakened logical argument, which is everything I just said. Basically replacing the first premise with unless he or she had good reason to permit it, and then adding another premise right after 2 that says there is no good reason that a morally good, omnipotent being could have to allow suffering. So now we have a valid argument, but it is different than the argument we started with. So, at some point, the atheist ends up having to concede that the logical argument is a failure, because the theist would say that even if we're talking about not a morally perfect being, but just a human, we're never able to say for sure if someone acted without good reason. So if we can't even say that with a human, we definitely can't say that about a perfectly good being. So we don't have any way that we could decide whether God had a good reason to permit suffering or not. So that's why this argument has to just end up failing. Then we get a different argument from Antony. So, let's see. So we have this the same. Trying to decide how much I have to erase. So we have to add a premise after 2. And instead of the added premise that we made earlier, it's going to be a little different. The whiteboard's really not that helpful anyways, so we're just going to look at your book. It's on page 41. So we keep the same premise that we changed, that no morally good being would fail to prevent suffering if he or she were able to prevent it, unless he or she had a good reason to permit it. Then, next premise, an omnipotent being would always be able to prevent suffering, because he's all-powerful. Then, probably, there is no good reason that a morally good, omnipotent being Probably, there is no good reason that a morally good, omnipotent being could have for failing to prevent suffering. So instead of saying there is no good reason that a morally being... Alright, now that I told the story about kids getting beat in elementary school, now I'm off my game. Anyways... Okay, redo. And I'm not going to edit this out. So, I know that y'all will see me screw up, and I'm going to take that for what it is. Acknowledge it, it's fine. Some people fail in front of others. It's fine. Anyways, so, there we go. Probably, there is no good reason that a morally good, omnipotent being could have for failing to prevent suffering. Then the third premise is, therefore, if there were a morally good, omnipotent being, then probably there would be no suffering. There is suffering, therefore, probably there is no being who is both morally good and omnipotent. So, basically, we're just weakening all of the premises of the argument. And she calls this an evidential argument because it's basically like, it seems like from the evidence around us, it seems that probably there's no good reason that a morally good omnipotent being could have for failing to prevent suffering. We don't know this for sure. That's why she puts probably in front of that. And we also don't know for sure that if there was a morally good omnipotent being, then there wouldn't be suffering. We assume, but we don't know. So then you get the conclusion that it's a weak conclusion, but it's more helpful than a logical argument that just totally fails. It's that probably there's no being who is both morally good and omnipotent. So even though she's weakened the original argument, she has an argument that actually stands on its own 2 feet. The other argument we saw will just fall apart in some ways. If you keep it at its most basic conception, then a theist could look at it and point out the problem and be done. Be like, okay, your argument failed. But with this, it's harder to argue, even though it's weaker. So her goal in this is not to prove that God doesn't exist, but it's to give reason that atheism is justifiable. So she can be justified in her atheism. That doesn't mean that atheism is proven to be 100% true. It just means that there is reason to think that it's the right answer. For lack of a better word. That it's the right view to have. So another point that she makes is that a requirement that would have to be met for God to have a good reason for permitting the amount of suffering we observe in the world is that the reason would have to be very, very, very important. So if there is a reason that God permits suffering in the world, it must be a wildly important reason because of the sheer amount of suffering going on in the world. So I think in this way, she's trying to cast doubt upon the theist's belief. Let's see. Then she gets to another point, which is that she's been using this example of parent and child, right? So the parent and the child with the toy. The parent lets the toy get soaked and ruined to teach the child, don't leave your toys out. And there are some other ways that the parent would have to allow the child to suffer in order for them to become better or to learn valuable lessons. Now she says, in what sense could the suffering... Let's see. Rewind. Basically, the human parent has limitations. There are things that if the parent is going to orchestrate a good thing to happen, that bad things must happen. Because the human person is limited. They don't have all power. And they're not all good and they're not all knowing. Now with a God who is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, where are the limitations? So why would there be a circumstance where God necessarily had to allow suffering for the greater good? God is in charge of everything if he's all powerful. So there should never be a case in which God is constrained and has to allow suffering in order for good to happen, because God's all powerful. So if he wants good to happen, he should just make good happen. Why would he have to allow suffering too? He's like in charge. It's like, let me think. It's like if I got on here and the whole time complained about, I hate how much I have to grade. I hate how I have to record these lectures. I hate the material we're reading, like it's really boring. If I did that, well, I'm in charge of all of those things. I assigned the things that I have to grade. I assigned the reading. So I'm not constrained to be reading things that I hate. So I should just change it. So God is in control of all things. So he should just change them. He's not limited. And then Antony also brings up the example of we could see for humans how suffering could create the greater good in some ways. But what about an animal that is all by itself in the wilderness and it's suffering? It gets a broken leg or something. It trips over a rock. In what way would that suffering be beneficial to anyone anywhere? Like there's basically no benefit to that suffering. So it seems that God would just be this evil little puppet making this antelope break its leg for no reason. So non-human suffering can end up, being an argument against the existence of God. So back to the necessity and the constraints on God. Some theists might respond to, hey, God has no limitations, so he can do whatever he wants. A theist might respond and say that there is one constraint that God has, and it is the constraint by logical necessity. So God can't do things that are a logical contradiction. For example, let's see. Let me get a good example. Hold on. Oh, well, she gives a good example. I'll just use hers. So God cannot create, cannot create this piece of paper to have both spiders on it and not spiders on it. So a logical contradiction God can't do because God is logical. He makes sense. So if we take into account the free will defense that a lot of theists will use, especially Christians, I'm not 100% sure about Jews and Muslims, but a lot of Christians would say, in order for God to create beings with free will, he must refrain from interfering with the actions they freely choose to perform. So free will is a good, according to this argument, and God is going to allow this to happen. And because he allows for free will to be had by his people, then he can't interfere with the person's decisions because they have free will. And free will can't be interfered will. So if free will could also be interfered with, then it would be a logical contradiction. So that's how the logical necessity comes in. So, let's see. So though someone might use a free will defense argument, which is actually what we'll be reading, or what you have read at this point, what we'll be talking about for Thursday. Let's see. Let me make sure I'm not forgetting anything before we move on. So even though God could allow for free will, then we go back to the animal suffering argument, which is that even with free will, that doesn't affect the animals in the wilderness by themselves that suffer. So we're kind of going to she kind of goes to a different point again to make the argument that free will doesn't really sidestep the problem. And she's still admitting a weakened argument. So I think that's how she's able to end successfully, was that she weakened her argument. So she says, when we confront seriously the amount of suffering in the world, fawns dying in fires, children struck with painful illness, adults enduring pointless depression, and consider the way it is distributed, I think the rational conclusion to draw is that there is no good reason for it. So, it's not that this is the only possible conclusion to draw, but that she thinks this is the most rational conclusion, that there's no good reason for these horrible things to happen. A good reason would have to be one that involved a surpassingly important moral goal, where the achievement of that goal required, in a sense strong enough to constrain an omnipotent being, the massive suffering we see in the world around us. It's not enough for the theist to insist that there could be such a reason, or to point out that we haven't proved that there couldn't be such a reason. The theist has to show us what such a reason might be, and if the theist cannot, then the evidential argument from suffering succeeds. So she admits, if the theist can come up with a good enough reason for all of this suffering to exist, then the evidential argument will fail. But she is pretty confident that that will not be the case, that the theist will not be able to come up with a situation in which there's a good reason for suffering. Now, thinking about papers, if I just said that and you think, I have a good reason for why there could be suffering in the world, then you should write on Antony's paper. That would be great. That would be a great idea. Yeah. So, I know I got a little mixed up in the middle of this, just reminiscing on old times, but I hope that it was clear. If you have any questions about the problem of evil or this argument or any iteration of the argument from evil, then just hit me up. Let me know. For the next lecture, we'll be talking about Eleanor Stump's response to the problem of evil, and I'm going to try and bring in some other readings because I think there are better responses than what Stump gives. So we shall see if I do that. Yeah, so I hope everybody's having a good week, had a good Labor Day, I hope. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you next time.